When loneliness weighs heavier than the vine's failing harvest, Meredith finds herself craving something she hasn't dared to seek in years: connection. A chance encounter with a mysterious new neighbor stirs buried desires. But can she trust her fragile heart to someone again? In the shadows of her vineyard struggles, a partnership begins to bloom, promising not just salvation, but a second chance at love. There's something about the late afternoon light that stops me in my tracks every time. It creeps over the hills like a slow golden tide, making the vineyard glow. The vines shimmer, their leaves catching the day's final rays. I lean on the veranda railing, watching it all unfold, just like I do most evenings. This place, this vineyard, used to mean everything to me. It was a source of pride, a legacy my father left behind. Now, though it feels like a fading reminder of all I'm losing, the vineyard isn't thriving the way it once did. And honestly, neither am I. Meredith. His voice comes from behind me, pulling me back to the present. I turn, maybe a little too quickly, hoping my face doesn't betray the sudden thud of my heartbeat. Rowan's standing in the doorway. His shirt is unbuttoned at the top, sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal forearms that look like they belong in a magazine spread. The sunlight catches the copper tones in his hair, and for a moment, I can't help but notice the way he carries himself, so confident, so effortless. Yes, of course, I say, forcing a smile and hoping my voice sounds steady. I take a step closer, careful not to let my gaze linger too long. But it's hard. Too hard. His broad shoulders, the quiet strength in the way he stands. It's a distraction I don't need right now. He steps forward, and with him comes the faint scent of crushed grapes and something earthy, grounded. I was thinking, he says, stepping closer, his voice dropping into a low, almost conspiratorial tone. We need to make bold moves if we want to save this place. Maybe we take risks this season, start with the harvest schedule. I nod, doing my best to focus on his words. But how can I? Rowan is 32. He's young enough to be my son. And yet there's something about the way he looks at me, the way he speaks with quiet conviction. It stirs something inside me, something I haven't felt in years. That might work, I reply, though I barely register what I've just agreed to. He's closer now, close enough that I can see the faint stubble along his jawline. I catch myself staring and swallow hard, forcing the thoughts out of my mind. Stop it, Meredith. He's here to help save the vineyard, not feed your foolish fantasies. But the whispers of the workers tell a different story. A few weeks ago, I overheard two of them in the equipment shed, talking in hushed tones about Rowan's past. Something about another vineyard he'd worked at, and a scandal that never made it to the newspapers. I brushed it off then, but now, I can't shake the feeling there's more to him than meets the eye. I've been so careful to keep things professional, to maintain a safe distance. But the quiet moments we share, walking the rows of vines, sampling blends late at night, they're starting to get to me. Every glance lingers a second too long. Every brush of his hand feels like it carries more weight than it should. One night, over a bottle of wine, Rowan had shared a story about his father, a man who had built his own vineyard from scratch, only to lose it all to a bad deal. He trusted the wrong people, Rowan had said, his voice heavy. I swore I'd never make the same mistake. Now, that memory feels like a warning I failed to heed. What do you think? His voice pulls me out of my thoughts, and I blink, realizing I haven't been paying attention. Sorry, what? I ask, trying to sound composed. Rowan smiles, and there's a knowing edge to it, as if he can see right through me. I said we should open a bottle of the '09. See if that's the profile we want to aim for. The '09. A year filled with promise, much like how I saw myself back then. Hopeful, full of energy. But the vineyard has aged, just like I have, and we're both struggling to hold on. Let's do it, I say, trying to ground myself in the conversation. I'll meet you in the cellar. As I turn to leave, I feel his eyes linger on me a second too long. Meredith, he calls softly. I pause, glancing back. You know you don't have to do all this alone, he says, his voice laced with something I can't quite place. Sympathy? Or something deeper? The cellar has always been my refuge. Rows of carefully aged bottles line the walls, each one a symbol of hard work, family, and love. It's the one place I go to feel connected to something bigger than myself. But tonight, as I descend the stone steps, it feels different. The air feels heavier, the space more intimate. The tension of the day still lingers. Camille had called earlier, her voice tinged with frustration. Why don't you ever pick up, Mom? I get it. You're busy with the vineyard. But I'm trying to talk to you about something important. I'd promised to call her back, but here I was, escaping to the cellar instead. Rowan's already there, examining a bottle with those strong, capable hands. He hasn't noticed me yet, so I let my eyes linger for a moment longer than I should, watching the way his muscles shift under his shirt as he works the corkscrew. Got it, he says, grinning as the cork finally pops free. He turns toward me, holding the bottle like it's a prize. Shall we? I nod, stepping closer. The tension is palpable now, a silent hum in the air. He pours the wine into 2 glasses, handing one to me. For a split second, our fingers brush. It's nothing, just a passing touch. But it sends a spark through me all the same. To new beginnings, Rowan says, raising his glass. I smile, though his words hit somewhere deep inside. A new beginning? What would that even look like? We sip, and the wine is everything I expected, rich, bold, layered. But my mind is far from the glass in my hand. It's on him. On the way his eyes seem to hold mine for a second too long. This is good, he says, breaking the silence. Really good? Yes, I reply, though my voice feels distant. One of our best years. The conversation meanders, but my thoughts are anything but calm. The wine has loosened the tight grip I've been holding on my emotions, and suddenly I realize something. I can't keep ignoring this feeling. The moment is heavy, the air between us electric. I don't know if it's the wine loosening my guard, or the weight of emotions I've kept buried for far too long. But before I can stop myself, I take a step closer. My hand reaches out, and suddenly our lips meet. It's not a soft, hesitant kiss. It's fierce, urgent, and filled with every unspoken feeling I've tried to ignore. Rowan is caught off guard. I can feel it in the way he stumbles slightly, as if unsure whether to push me away or pull me closer. But after a heartbeat of hesitation, his arms wrap around me, and he kisses me back with an intensity that takes my breath away. His hands, rough from the day's work, glide gently down my back, pulling me closer. The taste of wine still lingers on my lips, blending with the warmth of his kiss. And suddenly the vineyard, once a symbol of struggle, becomes the backdrop to something I never expected. A rekindling of passion I thought was lost forever. When we finally pull apart, both of us breathless, I can see the same hunger in his eyes that burns inside me. Meredith, he murmurs, his voice barely above a whisper, his lips still just inches from mine. I close my eyes, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. We shouldn't, I manage to say, but neither of us moves away. The space between us seems to shrink, and the air grows heavier, charged with something I can't name. Rowan takes a shaky breath, his chest rising and falling. Then he steps back slightly, and in a swift motion, pulls his shirt over his head. I try to keep my composure, but it's impossible not to notice the defined lines of his chest, the strength in his frame. He looks at me, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Slowly, deliberately, he reaches for the buttons of my blouse. My heart races as he works each one free, his fingers steady yet unhurried, until the cool air of the cellar brushes against my skin. For a moment he steps back, his gaze sweeping over me with an expression that makes my breath catch. There's something in the way he looks at me, like I'm beautiful, desirable, that makes years of self-doubt fade into the background. I'm not sure what I expect next, but what happens takes me completely by surprise. Rowan picks up the bottle of wine we'd been sharing, tipping it slightly. A cascade of rich, dark liquid spills over me, the sensation cold and unexpected. Rowan, I gasp, shivering as the wine trickles down my skin. But the look in his eyes stops me from saying more. He's utterly captivated, like he's seeing something extraordinary. He leans in, his lips tracing the path of the wine, his movements slow and deliberate. I can feel every inch of his touch, every breath against my skin, and it's overwhelming in a way I can't describe. For a moment, the world narrows to just this feeling, this connection. The glasses we'd been holding lie forgotten on the floor, as we lose ourselves in the moment. There's a rawness, a vulnerability, in the way he touches me, as if he's rediscovering something he didn't realize he'd been searching for. By the time we pull away, Both of us are changed. My heart is racing, my mind spinning, and for the first time in years, I feel alive, completely and utterly alive. In the days that follow, life at the vineyard seems normal on the surface. By day, we're all business, discussing harvests, soil conditions, and plans for the future. But when the sun sets and the vineyard is cloaked in darkness, everything changes. Our professional boundaries dissolve, replaced by something raw, something primal. I know it's reckless. I know the risks, the whispers of doubt in the back of my mind constantly reminding me of what I stand to lose. He's so much younger than me, and the logical part of me knows this can't last. And yet when Rowan looks at me the way he does, like I'm vibrant, like I still matter, it's impossible to listen to that voice. For the first time in decades, I don't feel like a woman holding on to the remnants of a crumbling legacy. With him I feel alive. For the first time in years I feel alive. Rowan and I spend our evenings in the cellar, or hidden among the rows of vines. Sometimes we talk about everything, our dreams, our fears. Other times we don't say a word, letting the quiet fill the space between us. There's a comfort in that silence, a connection that doesn't need explaining. We laugh, we drink wine, and in those moments I forget. I forget about the vineyard's precarious finances, the endless worries that keep me awake at night. All that matters is the way Rowan's hands find mine. The way he holds me like I'm something fragile, yet unbreakable. But deep down, I know this can't last. Nothing ever does. The knock on my office door interrupts the stillness of the afternoon. I've been staring at the numbers, my stomach sinking lower with every line. The vineyard is barely holding on, and I don't know how much longer I can keep it afloat. The door creaks open, and I'm startled to see 𝐤𝐤𝐤, my daughter. She steps inside with her signature energy, her eyes lighting up when she spots me. "Mom," she exclaims, her voice warm and familiar. I stand, caught off guard but thrilled, wrapping her in a tight embrace. It's been far too long since I've seen her. "𝐤𝐤𝐤, what are you doing here?" I ask, holding her close and marveling at how much she's grown. "I've got a 2-week holiday," she says with a grin. "Thought I'd come spend some time with you. Maybe help out around the vineyard." My heart swells with joy, the kind of motherly pride I haven't felt in years. "That sounds perfect," I say, smoothing a stray strand of her hair. "But what about work?" "It can wait," she replies with a casual shrug. "This place is important to me too, you know." Her words hit harder than she probably realizes. The vineyard, the legacy I've been fighting so hard to save, is as much hers as it is mine. But her arrival brings a twinge of guilt. What would she think if she knew my secret? If she found out about the man who has been my solace in the quiet, lonely hours? I push those thoughts aside. We have 2 weeks together. 2 weeks to reconnect, to make memories, to pretend everything is fine. The days fly by, filled with laughter and shared stories. I introduce 𝐤𝐤𝐤 to Rowan, and the three of us quickly fall into an easy rhythm, working side by side to keep the vineyard running. Rowan remains completely professional around her, and for that I'm endlessly grateful. In the evenings, we sit on the porch with glasses of wine, watching the stars. 𝐤𝐤𝐤 talks about her life in the city, her job, her friends. It's a reminder of the world beyond the vineyard, a world I've left behind. But it also reinforces why I'm fighting so hard to preserve this place. For her, for the future. Rowan joins us occasionally, his natural charm shining through as he shares stories about his own childhood and his passion for winemaking. I watch with a mix of pride and unease as 𝐤𝐤𝐤 hangs on his every word, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. I wonder if she suspects anything. Can she see the way Rowan's eyes linger on mine, even for just a moment too long? Or is she too caught up in her own admiration for him to notice? Either way, the tension in the air remains unspoken, a delicate balance none of us dares to disturb. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I retreated to the cellar. It's become my sanctuary, a place where I can breathe, surrounded by the rich scent of oak and fermentation. As I descend the stairs, I'm hit by an unexpected sound, muffled voices, low and intimate. I freeze, my heart racing. Something about the tone of those voices feels wrong, unfamiliar. The closer I get, the clearer the sounds become, and my blood runs cold. One of the voices is 𝐤𝐤𝐤's. I move without thinking, my feet carrying me toward the source. The door to Rowan's private quarters is slightly ajar, and through the narrow crack I see them. Camille, Rowan. They're together in a way I can't unsee, a way that shatters the fragile balance I've been clinging to. For a moment I'm frozen, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, betrayal, anger, heartbreak. I push the door open, and the room falls into stunned silence. They don't notice me at first, too wrapped up in each other. But when Camille's eyes finally meet mine, her expression shifts from bliss to shock, and then to horror. Rowan's gaze was calm, almost amused, as he looked up at me. He didn't even flinch, his movements deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. Meredith, he said casually, as if we were having a routine conversation. Camille, on the other hand, was frantic. She squeaked, clutching at the crumpled sheets to cover herself. Her face was flushed, her wide eyes darting between us. What are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice trembling with panic. Rowan, in stark contrast, didn't even bother with an apology. Instead, a smug smirk spread across his face as he turned toward me. Well, he drawled, his voice dripping with insincerity. "Look who it is. Fancy meeting you here, Viv. You want to join in? I mean, you and I have had plenty of practice together, haven't we? Might as well make it a real family affair." The audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow, the reality of his betrayal sinking in. In that instant, I saw him for who he really was, a man who had been playing us both, toying with our emotions for his own selfish amusement. Camille's face shifted, her confusion giving way to understanding. She looked between Rowan and me, piecing it together. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling with disbelief. But what I saw in her eyes wasn't pity, it was anger. Accusation. She wasn't looking at her mother anymore. She was staring at a stranger, someone who had shattered her trust. Then she started to scream. The sound was raw and piercing, cutting through the cellar's quiet like shattered glass. Rowan chuckled, completely unfazed. He stepped away from her, not even bothering to cover himself, and sauntered over to the wine rack. With infuriating nonchalance, he poured himself a glass of wine, as if nothing had happened. "Come on now," he said, his tone light, almost mocking. "It's not that big a deal." Camille scrambled to her feet, yanking on her clothes with trembling hands. Her movements hurried and frantic. "What the hell is wrong with you two?" she shouted, her voice a mix of rage and disbelief. "If I'd known you were already," she paused, her voice faltering before continuing, "involved, I'd have never gotten mixed up in this mess." She turned to face me, her expression one of raw hurt and betrayal. "Seriously, Mom? What is wrong with you? He's my age, for God's sake." Before I could respond, she stormed out, leaving a wake of anger and pain behind her. Rowan leaned against the rack, sipping his wine as if he hadn't just torn my life apart. He looked at me with that same smug grin, his words cutting through the silence. "It's just a little fun," he said with a shrug. "No harm done. No harm done." I spat, my voice trembling with fury. "You've been playing us both, treating us like nothing more than pawns in your stupid game." I pointed toward the door, my hand shaking with anger. "Get out. Now." Owen hesitated, his mask of nonchalance slipping for the first time. "You think you're so much better than me," he hissed, his voice low but venomous. "I've seen your books, Meredith. This vineyard's hanging by a thread, and you know it. I was your best chance at saving it." He shrugged again, as if my words didn't matter. Finishing his glass, he set it down with a casual clink, before heading toward the door. "Fine, if that's what you want," he said, pausing for a moment to smirk over his shoulder. "But I'm not sorry, Meredith. I'm young. I want to live life. I thought you'd understand that." With that, he was gone. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone in the suffocating quiet. My heart was racing, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of the chaos. I needed air. Grabbing my robe, I marched upstairs, desperate to escape the oppressive stillness of the cellar. But the house felt just as empty, too quiet without Rowan's easy laughter or Camille's warm presence. Camille had left too, leaving only a hastily scrawled note on the kitchen table. It read simply, "I can't believe you." Days blurred into weeks, and the vineyard's struggles didn't ease. I threw myself into work, trying to drown out the memories, but the weight of it all lingered. Every corner of the vineyard felt tainted now. Every spot where Rowan and I had shared a moment carried the sting of betrayal. The nights were the hardest. My bed felt colder, emptier than ever before, haunted by memories of his touch. The loneliness wrapped around me like a heavy cloak, suffocating and inescapable. But more than loneliness, I felt a longing, a desperate ache for something more. For someone who would see me not as a fleeting distraction or a symbol of desperation, but as the woman I truly am. Someone who could look past the tired exterior to find the fire still burning within. A woman who, despite everything, is still alive. The thought clung to me as I stood on the veranda the following morning, the mist rolling off the vineyard like a soft gray tide. A warm cup of coffee rested in my hands, its steam curling into the air. The vines bare now looked tired, much like I felt. As I stared out at the rows of my father's legacy, I noticed something unusual. A man was walking along the edge of the property, his tall figure silhouetted against the early light. He moved with a certain deliberation, pausing every few steps to survey the ground or scribble something in a small notebook. Who on earth is that? I muttered to myself, curiosity pulling me toward him. By the time I reached the edge of the vineyard, he was crouched by one of the boundary markers, examining the soil. "Can I help you?" I asked, doing my best to sound authoritative. He looked up, startled, and for a moment, his piercing green eyes caught me off guard. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands, and gave me a sheepish smile. Sorry about that," he said, his voice deep and warm. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'm 𝐥𝐤𝐬𝐵 Carter. I recently bought the property adjacent to yours." He gestured toward the line of trees separating our land. "Well, Mr. Carter," I replied, folding my arms, "it's not every day I find a stranger poking around my vineyard." "I understand," he said, his smile widening slightly. "But I'm not just any stranger. I'm a soil scientist by trade. I was curious about the terrain here. It's rare to find land with such potential. You're sitting on a gold mine." I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out a little bitter. "A gold mine that barely pays the bills." He tilted his head, studying me for a moment. "Perhaps it just needs a little push in the right direction. Have you ever considered cross-pollination between vines? Or introducing cover crops to regenerate the soil?" I blinked, caught off guard by his directness. Most people avoided talking about my vineyard struggles, but James seemed genuinely interested, not patronizing. "You sound like you know a thing or two about vineyards," I said cautiously. "My family owned one for years," he explained. "I left to pursue other opportunities, but I've always had a soft spot for places like this. When I saw this property for sale, I couldn't resist." His earnestness was disarming, but I'd been charmed by a man before, and I wasn't about to make the same mistake. "Well, Mr. Carter," I said, forcing a polite smile, "if you're interested in exchanging farming tips, feel free to schedule an appointment. But please, stay on your side of the property line." James chuckled softly, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Understood, Ms. Meredith," I replied curtly, turning on my heel and heading back toward the house. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't ignore James Carter. He seemed to be everywhere, fixing fences, clearing debris, or simply walking his property with that ever-present notebook. Despite my initial wariness, he never pushed too far, and soon, I found myself waving to him in passing or exchanging polite greetings. One particularly frustrating afternoon, I found him leaning against the fence separating our vineyards. "You look like you could use a hand," he said, nodding toward the tractor I'd been wrestling with for the past hour. I wiped the sweat from my brow. "Unless you're a mechanic, there's not much you can do." "As a matter of fact, I am," he replied, climbing over the fence with an easy confidence that both irritated and intrigued me. To my surprise, James had the tractor running within minutes. "There you go," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "Thanks," I muttered, reluctant to admit how much I appreciated his help. He didn't leave right away. Instead, he lingered, looking out over the vineyard. "This place has history," he said softly. "You can feel it in the air." His words struck a chord in me. "It does," I admitted. "But history doesn't pay the bills." James turned to me, his gaze steady. "Maybe I can help with that. I've been thinking, what if we collaborated? My property has room for expansion, and your vines are some of the oldest in the region. We could create something special together, The idea was tempting, but it felt too risky. I barely knew this man, and the wounds Rowan had left were still fresh. "I'll think about it," I said, my tone guarded. James didn't push the subject, but his presence became a steady, reassuring part of my days. We'd often find ourselves talking over the fence, our conversations ranging from soil quality to life in general. One evening, he invited me to dinner. I hesitated, the weight of past mistakes heavy on my shoulders, but something about his sincerity made it hard to say no. His home was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of rosemary and garlic. Over a simple meal, we talked about everything: his family, my struggles with the vineyard, and the dreams we both thought we'd lost. "You're stronger than you think, Meredith," he said, his voice soft. "You've kept this place alive against all odds. That takes courage." I looked at him, my heart twisting with a mix of gratitude and fear. I wanted to believe him, but the scars Rowan had left made it hard to trust anyone, let alone a man who seemed too good to be true. As the weeks passed, James's proposal for collaboration lingered in my mind. Camille, noticing our growing connection, was less than thrilled. "Mom, are you seriously considering this?" she asked one evening. "You barely know him. What if he's just another Rowan?" Her words stung, but they weren't entirely unfounded. I'd asked myself the same question countless times. "I don't know," I admitted. "But he's different, Camille. He doesn't want to take something from me. He wants to build something with me." She shook her head, her skepticism evident. "Just be careful, okay? I can't watch you get hurt again." One crisp autumn morning, James surprised me with a bottle of wine. "It's from my family's vineyard," he explained. "I thought we could open it together, celebrate new beginnings." As we sat on the veranda, the golden light bathing the vines, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. "You've been afraid to take a chance," James said, his gaze meeting mine. "But life's too short to let fear hold you back." His words resonated deeply. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future not defined by loneliness or regret. "I'll do it," I said suddenly. "Let's collaborate." James's smile was wide and genuine. "You won't regret it, Meredith." And as we toasted to new beginnings, I realized he wasn't just talking about the vineyard. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Not because of the past, but because of the promise of what lay ahead.